are military analytics. Russian President Vladimir Putin was hit by his most trusted and loyal ally when he least expected it. Putin's last stand. Lukashenko drove Putin crazy with an offer for the benefit of Ukraine. Lukashenko showed that he stands by Ukraine with this demand. So why is Lukashenko suddenly changing sides and taking such a risk against Putin in light of the developments this week? It seems that Belarus is no longer officially on the side of Russia. Let's examine together Lukashenko's offer to Putin, its importance for Ukraine, and the striking developments. The Ukrainian army has been taking a series of measures for a long time. Within the intelligence reports that Russia will launch an attack through Belarus and that a third front will be opened in the war. Information from the region confirms this intelligence. There are many Russian soldiers on the Belarus-Ukrainian border, and these soldiers are very active. They are constantly conducting exercises and sometimes even harassing the Ukrainian side. Within weeks, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko flatly denied Russia's claims that it would attack Ukraine via Belarus. Since then, there have been allegations that the relationship between Lukashenko and Putin has become very strained, and this tension is reflected in the soldiers of both sides. An incident took place the other day that proves these claims. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has called for a ceasefire in the large-scale war launched by his Russian counterpart against Ukraine in February 2022. Lukashenko called for Ukraine and Russia to start negotiations without preconditions. In his speech the other day, Lukashenko said, "We must stop before the discussion begins. I will risk proposing an end to hostilities and a ceasefire." Although Belarus, a staunch ally of the Kremlin, did not directly participate in the Ukrainian conflict, Russian troops have been allowed to conduct exercises on Belarusian soil since the start of the war. The country was used by Russia as a ramp to start the Ukraine war. Last month, Lukashenko invited Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden to a summit in Minsk to stop the war in Ukraine and prevent further loss of life. All Ukraine's territorial integrity, reconstruction, security, and other issues can and should be resolved at the negotiating table without preconditions. The Belarusian leader also lashed out at countries that supplied weapons to aid Kiev in the war. As a result of the efforts of the USA and its satellites, a full-scale war was launched in Ukraine. A third world war with nuclear fires is on the horizon, said Lukashenko. I will take the risk of offering to stop the fighting without the right to act, declaring a ceasefire without the right to transport weapons and ammunition, manpower and equipment. He finished his words. Very few countries were on the side of Russia during the war. One of these countries is Belarus. Belarus has been one of Russia's biggest supporters in Russia's war with Ukraine due to its geographical location. President Lukashenko's close relations with Putin and the country's administration with the same policies as Russia. But it looks like this support has ended in light of the developments this week. It seems that Belarus is no longer officially on the side of Russia. Lukashenko also warned that Russia can use its most fearsome weapon, nuclear weapons, whenever it feels threatened. Defeating a nuclear power is next to impossible. Russia may use the most dreadful weapon if it understands that the situation threatens to cause Russia's disintegration. This should absolutely not be allowed. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus and said the move would not violate the non-proliferation treaties. Ukraine's National Security Council responded by saying that Putin had taken Belarus as a nuclear hostage. In these ways, Russia contributes to internal instability in Belarus. The U.S. sees no reason to adjust its strategic nuclear stance, although there is no indication that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons. Putin is constantly repeating his nuclear weapons bluff and may turn it into reality if he realizes that he's going to lose the war. So is it permissible to use nuclear weapons placed in Belarus in the future? Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko may be powerless in the face of growing Russian pressure for the Kremlin to allow the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine that it plans to store within its borders. Over the weekend, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced for the first time in decades that his country plans to deploy nuclear weapons within the borders of its closest European ally. The move seen by many as a bluff by Russia to pressure the West to force the country to surrender to the ceasefire terms was nonetheless denounced by Ukrainian officials who said that the Kremlin had taken Belarus as a nuclear hostage. This decision by Putin can clearly be defined as the escalation of tensions in Eastern Europe. In this case, Putin should not increase tensions, but should take actions to soften the atmosphere. This whole development is an informational operation by the Kremlin to remind the entire Western world that Russia has nuclear weapons, because they know that many in the West instinctively overreact every time this issue comes up. All of this causes Western states to pause and hesitate before doing what needs to be done to ensure Ukraine wins. But the move is more significant as it brings the Belarusian leadership even closer to Putin and leaves Lukashenko vulnerable to his political opposition. Shortly after the Kremlin's announcement, Belarusian dissidents in exile claimed that the act of planting nuclear weapons in Belarus was an unacceptable development that could make Belarus a potential target for preemptive or retaliatory attacks by Ukrainian forces. Some observers argue that such a decision could simply indicate that Lukashenko was either forced into the decision by Russia or struck a deal with Putin to stay in power as the Kremlin sought to consolidate its influence in Eastern Europe. The Russians claim that Lukashenko has long wanted to deploy its nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil. But of course, Lukashenko would never admit to being repressed if that's what really happened, which means we'll never know the background. As for the Russian influence on Lukashenko's Belarus, this is arguably significant. Faced with another popular uprising, Lukashenko will have to take refuge in Putin ahead of Lukashenko's recent address to the nation. Some observers believe that Lukashenko has no other choice. Even if this is the Kremlin's ruse to pressure the West, it still places him and his country under Russian control. This further weakens Lukashenko's position. It remains to be seen how the opposition in Belarus will react beyond the statements they have made so far. The US government is already taking steps to take the Belarusian opposition to court. US officials met with Tsikhanovskaya the other day to stress US support for the Belarusian people to pursue a sovereign and democratic future, including free and fair elections and the protection of human rights. The United States, along with its allies and partners, will continue to hold the Lukashenko regime accountable for its actions. Lukashenko is not a well-liked figure by the Belarusian public. The most obvious indication of this is that after the 2020 Belarusian elections, the people rioted, and mass protests began across the country. Lukashenko's acting against the interests of his people and taking a direct side in the war will undoubtedly prepare his own demise. Considering the current course of the war, Putin, who clearly feels betrayed, will not help Lukashenko when this scenario happens. It is difficult to know what will happen next and what the next days will bring. But we do know that if Lukashenko continues to make more concessions against Putin, he will have prepared his own end. The Russian army is experiencing something it never expected in Ukraine. Russia thought it could easily invade Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army is showing a historic resistance. Russia is suffering one of the worst defeats in history. Due to the defeat, Russian soldiers started to surrender. The surrender of Russian soldiers seems to be a major change in the course of the war. What is the reason for the surrender of Russian soldiers? Before deciding to go to war, the Russian army considered itself the most powerful army in the world. Russia, which underestimated Ukraine, is now in a pitiful state. The most important reason why Russia is in this situation is the successes of the Ukrainian army. One by one, Ukraine is thwarting Russia's plans and is being praised for its historic resistance. But is Ukraine's success a sufficient reason for Russian troops to surrender? To answer this question, we need to go to the field. Let's look for the answer on the battlefield together. There are 3 regions in Ukraine currently occupied by Russia. These regions are Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. Ukraine has managed to liberate more than half of the occupied territories by making the right and strategic moves. Ukraine is gaining the upper hand in the war. Russia's plans do not seem to have been given much thought thanks to Ukraine's operations. 105,960 military personnel have been killed so far. The war has been going on for 311 days. Russian soldiers are aware of their losses. Feeling defeated, Russian soldiers wanted to surrender. The Ukrainian army has psychological superiority over the Russian soldiers. Hundreds of soldiers are dying every day, which scares Russian soldiers who do not want to die. Surrender. In some occupied areas, Russian soldiers started waving white flags when they saw the Ukrainian army. It is known that Russian soldiers do not want to fight. The footage of Russian soldiers surrendering without engaging in combat is being recorded and constantly shared by the Ukrainian army. The surrender of Russian soldiers causes a loss of reputation for the Russian army. The moments when Russian soldiers surrender are recorded by unmanned aerial vehicles. Images are shared on social media. Other Russian soldiers show the greatest interest in the shared images. Russian soldiers sent these videos to each other via Telegram and talk about the need to surrender. Russian soldiers are in a difficult situation because their needs are not met in the Russian army. But the soldiers who surrendered were received better than they expected in the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers make videos saying that the Ukrainian army treats them well and invite other soldiers to surrender. Russian soldiers say that the Ukrainian army has facilities that the Russian army does not have. Putin's treatment of Russian soldiers in his speeches and sanctions has led to an increase in surrenders. Zelensky is making moves to turn the situation in his favor. He appears in front of the press and calls on Russian soldiers to surrender. Seeing the positive thoughts of the surrendered Russian soldiers in the army want to surrender. Zelensky changed the course of the war with his moves. Zelensky addresses Russian soldiers as follows. "We are listening to what you are talking about among yourselves. We know that the war is pointless. We know that you are ashamed of your defeat, and we know what you think about your state. On behalf of the Ukrainian people, we offer you a choice: surrender, and we will treat you the way people deserve. As you were not treated in the Russian army the way your army does not treat our army. The choice is yours." There are many problems in the Russian army. These problems make Russian soldiers want to surrender. The Russian army has the largest number of military personnel in the world. It currently has over 1 million military personnel and 2 million reservists. Russia, which has a crowded army, cannot cope with the problems in the army. There are 22 different autonomous republics in the Russian Federation. Minority groups mostly live in certain regions. These minority groups are compulsorily recruited into the Russian army. But there is a great racism against these groups in the Russian army. Russian soldiers and Russian commanders subject minorities to terrible conditions. They send minorities to risky operations and do not care if they die. The Russian army has a tense environment for many reasons. Soldiers are surrendering to the Ukrainian army in their regions because of the bad behavior and conditions they are subjected to. They know that Putin and the Russian government don't care about them, and they don't want to fight for Russia. The majority of the Russian people do not support this war either. Anti-war people are organizing protests and demonstrations in the main squares of Russia. The anti-war and rebel soldiers are known to say this is Putin's war, not ours. It is thought that the reason for this war is that Putin does not want to leave his seat. Putin, who wants his political career to continue, does not want to admit that the war is going badly for Russia. The Russian army consists of mercenaries and conscripts. Mercenaries have many privileges within the army. This disturbs the Russian soldiers who are conscripted into the army compulsorily. Mercenaries work under the Wagner Group. Mercenaries do not take part in risky operations and are paid much more than other soldiers. The director of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, is politically influential, and mercenaries only listen to his orders. Mercenaries do not follow the orders of Russian commanders. Biden believes that the Wagner Group committed many violations of international law during the war. It is thought that the Biden government will classify the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. As can be seen, the hierarchical order in the Russian army is broken. Russian generals, like the soldiers, do not want to fight anymore and resign. Inexperienced officers are taking the place of the resigned generals. This situation leads to further disorganization in the already broken Russian army. As the turmoil in the Russian army increases, Russian soldiers continue to surrender. Uncoordinated soldiers on the battlefield cause even more damage to the army. While the surrender of Russian soldiers is good for them, it also has important benefits for Ukraine. Russia wants its surrendered soldiers back. In return, Ukraine says it wants a prisoner swap. In this way, Ukraine gets back its soldiers captured by Russia at the beginning of the war. The Russian army was confident in its numbers and underestimated Ukraine. But now the Ukrainian army has an incredible superiority over Russia. Every day, Russian soldiers continue to surrender. If Russian soldiers continue to surrender at this rate, there will be no soldiers left in the Russian army to fight Ukraine. John Spencer, a retired U.S. general, made statements about the course of the Ukraine-Russia war. He stated that the war will end in summer of 2023 due to the losses of the Russian army and the surrender of Russian soldiers, stating that Putin's invasion of Ukraine failed. Spencer also said that no matter how unsuccessful the invasion was, Putin would not withdraw. But there is also a claim that the war can be slowed down by Putin. The retired general said Putin may slow it down to gain power because of the problems in his army and weapons. At this stage, increasing support for Ukraine will be one of the moves that will put it in a more difficult position. If Russia is left alone in this war, it is enough for it to lose the war. What do you think about the surrender of Russian soldiers? Do you think Zelensky's speeches were effective and the surrender of Russian soldiers? What do you think about the problems in the Russian army? A lot of updates are coming from the Donetsk region here after solving problems with degraded assault units and replenishing and substituted damaged formations. Russian forces tried to recapture what they lost in the aftermath of Ukrainian counterattacks. They launched a series of tank assaults along the southern line. However, they faced experienced Ukrainian tank operators that won one duel after another for weeks. Last time I told you that Ukrainian forces took advantage of the decreased capabilities of some Russian formations and ongoing changes inside others, and conducted a series of successful counterattacks. I also told you that Ukrainians recaptured an extraordinarily important strongpoint in the south that dispels all Russian hopes of quickly taking Avdiivka into a pocket. The freshest reports suggest that the Russians put enormous effort in trying to recapture what they lost due to the unfavorable terrain. For Russians, pure infantry assaults, even with artillery support, are not even considered. That is why, after intense shelling, Russians immediately started using tanks to push Ukrainians out of their positions. Due to the intense fire, Ukrainians stepped one true line back. In order to not lose their men, however, they still continued preventing Russians from establishing control over the empty position. Russian sources reported that the situation was very challenging for them because at the moment Ukrainians noticed Russian armor in Virginia. They immediately sent their own tank to meet the assault unit. Recent combat footage shows a tank duel along the tree line just 1.5 kilometers north of Virginia. The Ukrainian tank successfully destroyed the Russian tank, forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle and flee. Judging by the number of destroyed vehicles caught in the frame, Ukrainian tank operators destroyed at least 3 Russian assault units. When it comes to the second of the 2 crucial strongpoints in front of Virginia here, Russians were less active because attacking it is even more difficult than the previous one. Russian forces still tried to conduct reconnaissance and establish positions in close proximity to Ukrainians. However, Ukrainian reconnaissance is also working on stop and immediately coordinates with the artillery to destroy the enemy on the approach. One of the limiting factors for Russians is that their positions in Virginia and Opiton are closer to Ukrainian positions than to their own. Since the fighting is taking place in the fields, Russian supply lines to these 2 villages are under extensive fire control and often in direct view. Recent footage shows how Russians try to reinforce Opener with a tank, but this tank never reached the village because it got caught by javelin because the previous batch of armor got destroyed in assaults around Opiton. Russian infantry here, for the most part, is just holding positions in the trenches. Ukrainian 53rd Mechanized Brigade showed a video that some Russian units simply do not withstand constant fire and at some point just abandon their positions. Ukrainian artillery is also targeting Russian equipment and ammunition in Donetsk. Donetsk is a huge city located right next to Avdiivka, so Russians are using a lot of buildings as storage. Recently, Russian sources even published footage of their equipment being sent from some warehouse inside the city to the front. So a successful identification and destruction of such warehouses can save many lives of the soldiers on the zero line. But despite the best effort of Ukrainian reconnaissance and artillery crews, Russians managed to accumulate forces to the north of Avdiivka for another wave of assaults. Ukrainian sources reported that over the last 2 days, Russians once again tried to establish control over Stupava. Unfortunately for Russians, because this was their second attempt and there was no element of surprise this time, Russians did not even manage to cross the rails. Today, a soldier from the 10th Assault Brigade reported that today Russian attack finally ended with massive losses and a retreat in order to decrease Russian morale even more. Ukrainian drone operators and artillery crews continue to chase Russians around the village of Krasnohorivka and also the surrounding trenches, in particular in front of the Turrican. The only place where Russians managed to advance over the last 2 weeks is in the area of Novobakhmut Kherson. Geolocated footage shows that the Ukrainian 36th Marine Brigade is trying to prevent Russians from crossing the highway. Since the Russians established positions near the destroyed bridge for more precise fire, the Marines also frequently deployed their tanks. Overall, the Russian failure to reinforce their units in Virginia on time led to the deterioration of their bridgehead that they unsuccessfully tried to return for 2 weeks. A former Russian head of the Donbass militia, Gherkin, recently said that the ratio of Russian losses in Avdiivka is even worse than in Bakhmut. Also, several weeks ago, Russians were reportedly relocating their 70-year-old T-55 tanks in the direction of Ukraine. And several days ago, some Russian sources confirmed that they arrived at the front. But it looks like Russians select not only armored but also regular vehicles, because 2 days ago, the senior priest of the Trinity Cathedral in the city of Kurgan conducted a ceremony and sprinkled holy water on the ancient vehicles before they were sent to the front.